Hello and welcome to Free Thinking Forum. I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, and my guest today is Ralph Wyman, who is the Director of MUUSJA, and let me try to get that right, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance.
That's
that right?
That's absolutely
All right.
correct, yes.
Well, what does such a long name do?
What does it do? Well, we are the public voice for our Unitarian Universalist values here in Minnesota. So we advocate and witness and do social justice work across the state of Minnesota for the Unitarian Universalist churches, fellowships, congregations, and individuals in our state.
Okay, and it's a state action network. Is that right?
Yeah, State Action Network, State Advocacy Network. It's a model of organizing that's been around for about a dozen years in a number of states: California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Michigan, Florida. We're in 15 states working as Unitarian Universalists on different causes. Social justice is a very important thing to folks in our denomination, and while we work at the congregational level often and also do work at the denominational level, what was missing before was something in between, sort of one of my colleagues calls it the meso layer, sort of halfway in between, that really state level decisions are where a lot of what impacts our lives happen. A lot in Minnesota of the issues that matter to people's lives are impacted or decided by legislators in St. Paul. And so let's organize to have an impact at that state level. That was the thinking for state advocacy networks.
Okay, so for example, I'm a person and I'm feel all alone here, and I keep reading about the problem with for base wage earners. All right, and so I I'm just going to check out a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Okay, so I go in and I start talking to other people about the fact that I believe that the base wage is too low and hurts the working poor and makes workers poor, which seems a kind of weird thing. All right, so then what can happen in this model then?
Well, if you were visiting a congregation and getting to know them, you'd probably connect to a social justice committee or council at your congregation, and then that social justice committee has a relationship with MUUSJA. Often, depending on the congregation, they might even have a board member that's part of our organization, but the different issues that we work on have volunteer leadership who then are sort of fan out and connect to the different congregations. And part of our work has been mapping to say which congregations are working on which issues. Like we know there's 27 congregations in Minnesota that are Unitarian Universalist, and at least 8 of them, including several of the largest congregations by membership, are working on homelessness and housing issues. And then within the homeless and housing campaign, one of the elements is Raise the Minimum Wage campaign. It's one of the platforms of the folks working on housing and homelessness, that you got to make enough money so that I think it's 30% of your income should go to housing. That's really hard to do if you're making $7.25 an hour. If you're putting $3 an hour, 40 hours a week to your rent, you're not going to be able to rent very much in the way of housing. So the way it connects is often through a larger issue campaign, and then we try and find if there's an issue or a topic that somebody wants to connect on, what's the larger movement that's dealing with that. So in our case, economic justice, wages fall kind of in 2 areas: housing and homelessness, as far as who's advocating, and then we also have a racial equity working group, and a lot of that is around finding pathways for folks who've been previously disenfranchised to getting family-sustaining jobs, whether it's construction or healthcare, different areas of work, that we're trying to change the system of who gets hired and where the jobs are and where the opportunities are, and trying to match up communities with the resources to get trained and get placed.
Oh, now, some folks may be thinking, now that seems like a long way from going to church. So what do you see as the connection between going to church and this kind of political action?
Well, first of all, just to be really clear, when we talk about political action, I refer to it as small p politics, that politics is how people get together and make decisions about our common resources, that we're not talking about electoral politics and certainly not talking about partisan politics. I want to make very clear that the work that we do is around issues, and it, from a, not to get too legalistic, but from a legal standpoint, folks sometimes worry that, oh, can a church talk about these sorts of things, or a temple, or whatever the denomination may be. And so first of all, the answer is yes. From a legal standpoint, you can't campaign for a candidate, you can't advocate for a political party as a faith organization. An individual person of faith, of course, can, but the church or congregation can't. But issue work that especially that relates to the mission of the congregation is totally appropriate and perfectly legal. There's no campaign finance issues or any of that sort of stuff. More broadly, I think for Unitarian Universalists, that we say that there's a moral imperative. There's our values. One of our foundational principles is the advocacy, is the belief in and use of the democratic process. The democratic process is how we make our decisions as a people in common, and so we feel like that doesn't just translate in how we make our decisions inside of our congregation, where we also use a democratic process, but that's the appropriate way to make our common resource decisions. We're all bound up together. I think that's a fairly core religious message, whether you're humanist or Christian or of any number of traditions. My destiny is bound up in your destiny, is bound up in how we treat and interact with people we see or don't even see. And so there's a religious component to having that the good of the commons, the good of others in mind. So yeah, let's work to improve the common good. Well,
speaking of that line of reasoning, how did you get to where you are? What was your religious journey like, if you don't mind my asking?
I suppose I was, my sort of social action awakening happened in college. I was at a mid-sized private university. It was affiliated with the Disciples of Christ denomination, although I had not grown up in that tradition. I've been a Unitarian Universalist since I was probably about the age of 10. Our family joined a UU church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We moved around a few times. So I was in college and began to, like a lot of folks kind of at that 18, 19 years of age, became aware of some injustices. One of the big ones on our campus that we were working on was that we had a very large endowment, and we were working, a group of us started working to try and get the university to divest from businesses that had been running operations and making a profit in South Africa. During the apartheid era. We felt that it was immoral, especially for a Christian affiliated university whose own denomination had said, you need to divest, and our university refused. We had a very interesting sort of battle, lasted a couple of years. Eventually, my understanding, again, I was not Disciples of Christ, but my understanding is about the time I graduated, they did get some progress from the administration. They moved off of just a core fiduciary, we can't touch it position. And then in my early 20s, I was living in Austin, Texas, and realized that I was gay, and started to think about, well, where would I want some support in figuring that out? And I thought, oh, I'll go to the Unitarian Church. I knew that they were LGBT affirming and welcoming. I hadn't been going to church for a few years. Joined the Austin Church, and pretty soon after that ended up on their social justice council, doing the Pride service and doing some different activities like that in my church. So, really from my early 20s, I started to see ways that my own congregation both could advocate for me, but also needed to be educated and informed on issues. Because, 1990, 91 in Austin, Texas, there was some work to do even inside of our congregation. More of it was outside, but moving towards being welcoming and affirming, and I always felt very supported in that congregation, and encouraged towards both personal growth and encouraged to do social justice work. It seems like it's been a recognized part of pretty much every congregation that I've been a member of since then. I was Austin and Minneapolis, and then others I've visited.
Well, and also, which brings to mind, because you were mentioning that it was a slow process, one of the interesting things about Unitarian Universalists is we continue to question our assumptions and prejudices, I think, and we keep trying to see where our blind spots were. We were an early adopter of having women as ministers, for example, so that in fighting those stereotypes back in the 19th century, for example, and we continue to kind of question ourselves. But just having a liberal attitude doesn't cut it, does it? It's like you have to work at even understanding how to get this out of your psyche or whatever.
Yeah, I think about sort of one of the challenges that is an opportunity, but one of the challenges for Unitarian Universalists is that we often are very open to having discussions about things that are a concern. It's how do we move from a discussion to action, and how to know what the right action is to take. I mean, some things seem a little more clear than others. If we're looking at some of the environmental issues, there's not as much controversy about sort of ways that we can reduce, be more efficient, be more choiceful in what we our personal choices and our organizational choices. But it can be trickier. Like, I went down to Phoenix a couple of years ago for our General Assembly, the denominational gathering every year, and the theme in Phoenix was immigration. There was a big discussion about whether we should even have our conference in Phoenix that year. They had just passed SB 1090, I think it was the number, very, very discriminatory, very, very negative legislation in Arizona, and there was a big discussion. Well, what do we want to do about that? And I think we did the right thing, which was to go and really engage with people in Arizona who were Latino, who were immigrants, both documented and undocumented, and said to them, how are you doing this work, and how do we support you in doing this work? Rather than, oh, we're the people, we're smart, because we have a bit of a reputation for being, we're careful thinkers, and we study, and we get a grasp on an issue, but knowing what the solutions are, often the folks on the ground living the problem are the ones who have the most lived wisdom of how to address their problems. And learning how to be an effective ally with folks in that work it's a growing edge for us. It's exciting. It's a real opportunity, but it's about getting. Yes, we need to do the education. Yes, we should have the conversation. We should have the adult forums and the coffee hour discussion and read the books, and then let's go to St. Paul or North Minneapolis or a city council meeting or, Zion Baptist in North Minneapolis and have a community meeting about workforce issues. Let's engage and engage for the long term.
Well, which brings me to my next question. What are some of the things that MUUSJA is working on right now, some of the areas?
So I kind of made mention to racial equity. That's certainly a big part of our work right now. We work with something called the Higher Minnesota Coalition. And it's a multi-ethnic, community-based coalition started in North Minneapolis around the time of the American Recovery Act 5 years ago. Money was starting to move into the state, and folks in North Minneapolis said, we've been through this before. We've seen public money come in, and it goes to the same old people who've always gotten the money. We need to do this differently. And our MUUSJA, our organization, found out about the Higher Coalition through some environmental folks that were interested in the $200 million of weatherization money that was coming. And we said, hey, there's a big opportunity. And the Higher folks said, the opportunity is to train the people in North Minneapolis and the east side of St. Paul and the other low-income communities that we're going to get the subsidized weatherization for their homes. Let's train them to install it. Let's train them and equip them to be the people who deliver the services to their own communities. That's the model that we're really working on, is to say, if you're going to build a Viking stadium, and we did not take a position, the actual creation of the stadium or not, we decided that was not something we could, in the short term, engage to say yes or no. But if it's going to happen, if we're going to invest $900 million, let's look at a 10-mile radius around the Viking Stadium and say, who should be driving in or riding transit or whatever and working on those projects? It should be people in North Minneapolis and Northeast Minneapolis. And the University Avenue corridor in St. Paul, and say the folks who are from communities of color, from immigrant communities, and previously economically disadvantaged, they still pay taxes. They're still part of the culture. They're still part of the community. Let's make sure that everybody has a chance to get trained and employed on these jobs, and then have a longer term opportunity to keep working construction, pays living wage, it's good work, family supporting. So that's one of our issues.
Others?
We have a long history on reproductive justice. It's an issue that, as a denomination, has I think distinguished us somewhat. That we think that women should be able to make the healthcare decisions they need to in their lives, and that sex education should be comprehensive and age appropriate and geared towards the real world. So we have supported the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in Minnesota for many years, engaged in work with them. And then really another one of our sort of long-term commitments has been to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. I got involved with MUUSJA. I'd been on the steering committee, the social justice committee for my congregation in South Minneapolis for a couple of years. And in 2006, I was asked as a volunteer to help organize. It was the first time we really thought a constitutional amendment might hit the ballot in Minnesota to prohibit the freedom to marry. And so I got involved in helping. That was a legislative effort. It turned out to be just an amazing year. We organized, I got involved at the steering level through Outfront Minnesota to organize a rally. We brought 2,000 people to the Capitol.
Wow.
It was at that time the biggest indoor rally that had ever happened at the Capitol, and it was saying, don't change the Constitution, don't mess with this, we are people of faith. And this was true interfaith effort. It was a weekday morning in February on a cold day, and 2,000 people showed up and packed the rotunda, and I think changed the course of the legislature that year.
Wow.
We were told afterwards that we showed up with a calm but focused and loving demeanor, and just said, we stand with our LGBT neighbors in love, in community, and the energy in the Capitol changed that day from one of sort of fear and trepidation to one, I think, of willingness to accept. And that has motivated me for years to say, we can have that much influence as a broad coalition. Now, obviously, 2,000 people, they were not all Unitarian Universalists, but we did a kind of casual head count. We figure there were at least 200 to 250 UUs in that crowd that morning. So
amazing.
It was a pretty exciting day for a little tiny denomination like ours to mobilize and connect and be in leadership with other denominations on that work.
Well, that's one of the amazing things about this particular state. Both of us have lived other places. Larger states are much more difficult to get into the halls of power.
Yeah.
But in Minnesota, a citizen can drive to the Capitol and actually easily meet with our representatives, and can really make a difference, can't we?
We can, and we just did a training. We did a nonpartisan training a few weeks ago with a couple of state legislators, one in Rochester and one in Minneapolis, and they both emphasized that because we have a legislature that only meets for part of the year, that especially for our congregations like in St. Cloud and Rochester and Iron Range and Duluth and so forth, we really encourage having meetings and contact and email with our legislators year-round in their district. Let's talk to them when they're at home too, as well as those great lobby days. The bus loads come down from Duluth and van loads come up from Rochester. We have some great on-the-spot, in the Capitol contacts with our legislators, but we're also building the ability to reach back and say, let's meet when it's not so crazy. Let's talk now. It's December, well, almost December. Let's talk now about the coming legislative session. And then after the session, there's another whole season that summer and into next fall when folks are accessible and thinking about the next year, the work we want to engage in. So we have a part-time legislature, but we can have a full-time citizen engagement in our issues.
That's taking it to the next level then.
I think it is, yeah.
Yes. What other justice issues is MUUSJA involved in or has been involved in? Or?
Well, we were very involved in the two amendment campaigns, and obviously we talked some about the LGBT issues, but we have a long history on voting rights as well. And in fact, Carol Johnson, who's a member of MUUSJA and a former Minneapolis City Council member, she co-authored a report in 2010 after she did a lot of the research contacting the county attorneys looking for evidence of election fraud. Because that's something we hear a lot about. We hear, there's a lot of election fraud. Well, Carol reached out to all the county attorneys, and I think 80% of them responded, and our report, co-authored with Citizens for Election Integrity, found that there's virtually no fraud. Now, there are other issues with elections that, that people are sometimes have difficulty voting. We believe that if you have a right to vote, you should be able to get to the polls, be able to register same day if necessary, and we have some of the best elections in the country here in Minnesota, the fairest and with the highest level of integrity. And I think our work has helped to support the awareness of the integrity and improvements to voting. So we care about voting rights. Again, that goes back to some of our core values around democracy. And the environment is another major area. We worked a number of years ago to help pass the 25% renewable energy standard in Minnesota. we're looking forward to this coming session to talk about what can we do next to both improve efficiency and clean energy. And we have to have some real conversations around fracking. Minnesota and Wisconsin are resources for frac sand. Maybe we should take a pause on that and look for some policy answers to, like, what are we doing? Let's not just dig it up because we can. That's a fairly detailed example, but our environmental work is a long-term commitment as well. That we want to change how we address the personal and things like reproductive justice and racial equity, but the larger environment needs to be sustainable for all of us to have an optimistic future together.
It's interesting what I hear you talking about. I mean, women making reproductive justice decisions for themselves, employing people with fair wages, and looking at the racial balances within these, in terms of the percentages of the population. What I hear you talking about then is really personal responsibility, is an insistence upon justice, helping to be sure that the individual is making his or her own decisions rather than, I don't know, the corporations make,
Well, yeah.
I don't want to be simplistic about this, but
it's an interesting analysis. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way necessarily, but that what we're very interested in a transparent government that's responsive, that supports the individual but has community values represented and reflected. That we're an individualistic culture, but we as I started out early in the conversation saying that my future is bound up in yours, and when folks have better options, better choices, and can plan for their lives, we all do better. I mean, it's the old Wellstone. We all do better when we all do better.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your social justice work and what you're doing out there in the world. Keep it up. And,
thank you.
You have a great vision for the future.
Thanks. And we're great to partner with congregations like yours to keep the work moving forward.
All right. Well, Ralph Wyman, MUUSJA, thanks so much. Until next time, I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society. Come and visit sometime.